Welcome everybody to this year's Sussex International Theory Prize Lecture. CAPE, the Center for Advanced International Theory, has basically set itself the aim to support and showcase excellent work in international theory, and also to make a case for the fact that theory is actually relevant for political practice. And out of the many activities that we are organizing and planning every year, I'm sure that awarding a prize for the best book in international theory every year surely must be the most enjoyable. It's enjoyable partly because we get to read the latest good books in international theory, but more importantly, I think, because we actually are allowed to, or even have to, say something positive about at least the prize-winning book. And as you can imagine, that is extremely liberating for people who are so socialized into criticizing other people's work all the time. So we actually really enjoy these prize awards and events. And we've got the winner of the 2013 Sussex International Theory Prize here today. Join me please in a warm welcome to Daniel Levine. He is a professor at the University of Alabama. His research interests lie in international theory, political theory, and Israeli-Palestinian politics. And he's published on all of these issues widely and variously, that is, not just in academic journals, but also in more public debate-oriented outlets. Now, the book that got the prize, I can't show it to you because Patricia stole my copy. The book that got the prize, there it is called Recovering International Relations, The Promise of Sustainable Critique. And in that book, Daniel sets out, he uses the work of Theodor Adorno to try and bridge the gap between theory and practice. The book is incredibly rich in terms of the sources it draws on. It draws on philosophy, political theory, international relations. It's quite an interdisciplinary work in some ways, or maybe even Renaissance type of scholarship. It's beautifully written. It's actually a joy to read. And although the subject matter is very complex and sophisticated, Daniel actually manages to make this very accessible to people who are not specialists in that field, which I think is a pretty good thing to achieve. And finally, Daniel doesn't just talk the talk, he also walks the walk, and that means that he actually tries to apply his theoretical reflections to a particular case in international politics, which is Israeli-Palestine, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, since we have awarded the prize to the book, lots of other people have done the same thing. It has also won, apart from our prize, the Yale Ferguson Award. It has had an honorable mention in the International Theory Section Book Award, in the International Ethics Section Book Award, and in the Charles Taylor Book Award. So you can see that people were scrambling and competing with us over recognizing this book. I don't know, actually, I don't have the dates, but I think we would like to say we got there first.
Oh, yeah, you did.
We did,
Yeah.
Okay, so Daniel, here is your prize. It's not just a piece of paper, it comes with 150 pounds worth of book vouchers from Cambridge University Press, and a 2-year subscription to International Theory, which is, of course, a fitting journal for someone winning this prize. And so I want to take this opportunity to also thank Cambridge University Press for supporting our center and the prize in this way.
Just thank you very much for that and for this. This is an enormous, those of you who are PhD, or I guess postdoctoral as you all say, candidates, will know the experience of working very hard on books in sort of small 1 meter by 1 meter rooms with no windows and no natural light. And you wonder if anyone will notice, right, when you're all done. So when these things happen, one is enormously grateful and almost a little bit speechless after. So thank you all very much indeed to the committee and to Joe and to Ben. Also, Joe and I had a very long correspondence, and I'm very grateful for the care and the kindness that I've been shown. Just a quick warning, I tend to talk a bit fast. I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure why it is. I have professionals that are consulting with me about that, but it's a work in progress. So I'm just going to rustle my papers for a minute. If anybody wants to move forward while I do that, feel free, and then I'll just go ahead and get started because I do talk fast. So, okay, all right, good. Right, thanks. I'm going to do two things in this talk. The first thing I want to do is walk you through some of the key arguments in this book that's been honored today, and give you some sense of how I came by them, why I wrote this book the way that I did, what I hope to do by it, and how I came across it. This is not a typical, it's certainly not a typical dissertation book, and I think it's also not a typical international relations theory book. And you know, for good or for ill, there's a reason why I came by the project and why I think it matters and why I think this presentation matters. I'm going to try to give you in an anecdotal sense first, and then in a more practical, or not practical, but rigorous sense, what the key concepts are. What I'll try to do after that is give you a sense of what I've been doing with this concept that I developed, this notion of sustainable critique since then, how the work that's being honored today informs, chastens, and guides, and complicates the work I'm doing now on Israeli-Palestinian politics, this notion of Jewish fear that I've been talking about and that forms the locus of my current research project. So the talk is structured in basically 4 parts. I'll do this brief overview and introduction, then I'll try to nail down in more concrete terms what I mean by the key concepts that I will walk you through anecdotally. Then I'll try to show why this approach is as elusive as it is in the field, why this problem, if you like, there are very few problems that wait 50 years for a solution. If Levine is correct, this problem has been sought after for 40 or 50 years, so why did it have to wait for Levine to show up, right? And lastly, I want to give you a sense of what I'm doing now by walking you through this notion of Jewish fear and kind of how I'm trying to unpack it and why I think it matters for the politics of Israel-Palestine, what it brings into that discussion that isn't there. So I think the best way into this project is to recount for you the situation or the circumstance I felt myself in. Some of you are undergraduates, some of you are early postgraduate students, some of you are later term postgraduate students. If you are, you will be in the process of sort of getting that first or second job. So in the early 2000s, I had kind of my second good job. I was finishing a master's degree in security studies at Tel Aviv University, and I was working as a kind of junior level coffee analyst or political analyst, or I guess coffee schlepper, political analyst, for the British Embassy in Tel Aviv. Between 1993 and 2000, the Israel and Palestine Liberation Organization were engaged in intensive negotiation at a high level, what was known to many as the Oslo-Madrid process, other times as the Middle East peace process, or if you wanted to show everyone how terribly in the know you were about such things, you might talk about the MEPP, and then if someone didn't know what that was, you could sort of snicker at how out of the know they were. Now, that process, as many of you know, failed to produce a stable two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. Why and when precisely it went into crisis is debated. Like everything else in that conflict, it's contested all the way down. What is not generally contested is that open, ongoing violence broke out in September 2000, and that a meaningful process has not since emerged, though the fervor with which the recent Kerry talks have been denounced by the radical end of Netanyahu's coalition may lead one to wonder what everyone is suddenly so worried about. At all events, like most of my colleagues at the time, I wanted to know why this process had failed. And I wanted to know not in the kind of reposed Humean curious manner that social scientists sometimes narrate to themselves. How did I come to that? Well, an apple fell on my head, and I just had to know, right? Rather, I had an intensely personal and practical problem on my hands. Like many others, I saw the Oslo process as a necessary and important response to a set of broader developments, both in the broader Middle East and at home. Developments about which many of us are still talking, right? The nuclearization of Iran, rising tides of dissatisfaction among youth in the Arab world, pitted against an aging and out-of-touch elite, the rise of religious radicalism in Palestine and more broadly, and of course issues we weren't talking about, but I really wanted us to be talking about, such as the decline of democratic values, institutions, and processes in Israel, and the rise of a parallel religious radicalism there as well. Success in the MEPP was key to fighting the domestic fights I wanted to fight in Israel, right? I wanted a stable, democratic, pluralistic state living in peace with itself and with its neighbors so that I could start arguing with folks I didn't agree with at home about stuff I wanted to fix at home, right? Thus, the failure for this process was a problem, and it was a personal problem, and I wanted to parse it out for very personal reasons. I began to try to parse the problem out by taking the measure of what it was, right? I took all the narratives I heard in the media, the government, the academy, and translated them into simple propositions. Now, there were a lot of these, but let me give you, half a dozen, because that's more than 3, but not too many. The first might be what you call a Hobbesian or classical realist narrative, right? That what we knew is the Oslo-Madrid process had been the attempt to moderate a state of war between two nations by creating two states, right? There was going to be a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli one. States have interests moderate personal behaviors, therefore the creation of two states and the continuing of conflict within two states will moderate the state of war between the two nations, right? Whether or not it's true, it's sort of, those of you who know Hans Morgenthau know that story. The second one might be a neo-realist narrative, that what we knew as the Oslo-Madrid process was a ripple effect following on a series of global geopolitical shifts from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the end of the 1991 Gulf War, engendering a rebalancing of relations between would-be client powers and would-be patrons. With the loss of Soviet support, many Arab states needed Washington, and the road to Washington passed at least through Tel Aviv, if not quite through Jerusalem. Hard as that may be to imagine now, Israel's leaders were for their part also afraid that calls for a peace dividend in the US and the complications that the US-Israeli alliance had imposed on the American war coalition of 1991 would lead the Americans to withdraw from their strategic commitments to Israel. So there was a particular moment when the Israeli leadership was afraid, and the thought was that we could press them into concessions that they would be able to make, right? So there's some kind of shift in anarchy, and that's creating a change in the balance of interests, right? So that would be your neo-realist narrative. Third, a globalization narrative. That this was a process by which a rising tide of global capital flows and trade would be harnessed to produce a gradual withering of a conflict. Fourth, my personal favorite, for reasons you'll see in a moment, an end-of-history narrative. And what we were witnessing in the Oslo-Madrid process was an historic convergence between the houses of Israel and Ishmael, a political miracle in a decade of political miracles from the fall of communism to the end of apartheid. Another chapter in Francis Fukuyama's book, 1993, as Annus Mirabilis. Fifth, a Gramscian narrative following the hegemony theses of Antonio Gramsci loosely, right? This was a process by which economic elites were able to deploy a combination of national and post-national imagery in order to endow what were in fact rather traditional relations of unequal exchange, colonialism, and economic exploitation with a new and ostensibly more progressive cast. Lastly, a Habermasian narrative in the spirit, if not precisely the substance, of Frankfurt School social theorist Jürgen Habermas. This was a gradual process of communicative learning in which public spheres were learning to evolve new norms of amity out of old forms of enmity. Now, fitting complicated events into conceptual narratives is kind of the classic work of social science. Some of you are probably doing it right now. As Talcott Parsons once put it, we take the distillate of past events and use them to make sense of present ones. There's nothing particularly mysterious or strange about this. Perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, some of you were reading ongoing or following poli-sci and area studies blogs discussing events in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, or the Gulf. If you were, you will recall academics in the initial stages of test driving ideas or events by running them through paradigms they knew. So you'll recall questions like this. Hey, the revolution in Egypt, is it more like the revolution of 1688, the French Revolution of 1789, the Springtime of Peoples in 1848, or the revolutions of 1989? The ponderous pace of academic production cycles being what it is, you will now see finished versions of those arguments in some of our more prestigious journals. My guess is that they've already been counted for the RAF, but that's a different story that we'll talk about later. Did it still call the RAF, or is it? Yeah, okay, sorry. In poli-sci, the generative frameworks and normative upshots of our debates are often hard to see because we use abstract theoretical language that doesn't always point back to their generative origins or debates. So, for example, scholars who debate whether to study the uprisings in Egypt through specialized Arab regional studies literature on the one hand, or generalized democratization theory on the other, may be rehashing an earlier generation of vituperative debates between the likes on the one hand of folks like Bernard Lewis, Fuad Ajami, Raphael Fatai, and Sam Huntington on the one hand, and on the other hand, folks like Edward Said and Joel Bainin. The question at stake there is there something special about Arabness that makes Arab democracy a particular contradiction in terms. Now, even if we don't intend our conceptual analyses to fall into these kinds of simplistic, ontological, ideological debates, to some extent, we can't help it. Concepts derive from real-world events, and they smuggle in ontologies whether we like it or not. There's not much we can do about this because there is no speaking from a space of perfect objective detachment. But then, neither is refusing to speak at all much of a solution to the problem, right? At least not if you want to write social theory. It's great if you're Beckett, right? It ain't so great if you want to do social theory. Certainly that desire to help, to contribute, to do good was what animated me as I looked at the Oslo process from the perspective of the Second Intifada. And as I did, I noticed what appeared to me at the time to be sort of strange given the training that I've been given. All of these explanations that I've been given, the classical, the neo-realist, the retreat of the state, the Gramscian, the Fukuyami, and the Habermasian, all of these ones I just gave you, all had the weight of truth in them, right? All felt like they described or disclosed something sort of interesting. Yet they were also kind of incommensurable with one another, right? They couldn't all be true, but in some important sense they were. And they summed up, or summoned up, if you like, incommensurable worlds along with them, right? The scholar Colin White tells us that that methodologies summon up their own ontologies. They summon up their own foundations and worlds, right? And in some sense, I was experiencing something like that as I'm doing this reflection. Let me give you the most fanciful version of the argument. Let me give you the most fanciful of the arguments I gave you to give you a sense of what I mean. Right? Remember that Fukuyamian end of history and its mirabilis argument? Okay. So there's Daniel Levine living in North Tel Aviv, right? And he thinks the peace process is a miracle, right? He thinks it's a miracle. He sees huge economic growth in the financial and managerial sectors. He sees new products and services coming available. Now suddenly we can buy Pepsi and not just Coke, right? Because there was this Arab blockade. You couldn't buy Hondas. You couldn't buy Subarus. You couldn't buy Pepsi. Oh, now suddenly you can buy all this stuff, right? More than all that, though, we had this sense in the 7 blocks of North Tel Aviv that I lived in, at least, of coming into the world. That, well, this state was now becoming normal in a way that it had always said it wanted to be, in the way that Herzl and the kind of key texts of our society had told us we had long aspired to be, if only our enemies would let us, right? We were about to become another smallish state in the European social democratic mold. We were about to become another Denmark, another Portugal, another Belgium, another New Zealand, another Ireland. Surely an end of history for us then. A happy ending to the problem, to the question of Jewish continuity in late modernity. At any rate, for the 7 blocks of Tel Aviv that I lived in. Now, if I was a factory worker in the south of Israel, the MEPP might have been the cause of my job being outsourced to a sweatshop in Jordan or Egypt. If I was a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, it would have meant being completely written out of the conversation entirely. You may recall that Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, had been forced to support Saddam in the 1991 Gulf War coalition, a decision which forced the PLO into political isolation and near bankruptcy. By doing the deal he did with Levine, he got himself out of Dutch with his Western allies, but was forced to cut Palestinian refugees from West Bank and Gaza out of the picture. And for many radical Israeli settlers, precisely that dream of normalcy that I waxed poetic about a minute ago, for them, that's the worst kind of liberal degenerate. That's the worst kind of liberal cosmopolitan degeneracy, right? What they would tell me, and I was a political advisor at the time, right? So I'd go to Knesset and I would sort of unfold this story that I just unfolded to you, and they would tell me tartly that the chosen people are not really supposed to aspire to normality, right? And that I really ought to, get back to my roots, right? So, as a student of international theory, I found that I could trace out any number of propositions and refine them by a combination of deductive explanation and intuitive interpretation. I found that each illuminated an important portion of reality, but I also discovered that each had a powerful ideological component when that portion of reality came to be taken as all of reality. Right? Taken together, explanations provide illuminations. As monistic single causes, they are simply tendentious. In the end, God help us, Ken Waltz, may he rest in peace, was right. Everything is related to everything else, and how you pull the world apart determines what you see. It then occurred to me, though, that if that's true, you could begin using deductive theories backwards. You could begin using them, if you like, hermeneutically, against the grain. You could posit an explanation for an event, and then ask, well, who would offer such an explanation? Whom would such an explanation serve? Cui bono? what work is done by this explanation, knowing that the world, being complicated, would support multiple explanations. By posing some explanations against others, you recall the limitations of each of them, bringing their particular constructions of fact and value to the foreground. Each theory told its own story and spoke to the question of cui bono, of what configurations in fact and value would resonate with whom in the political spectrum. To put this another way, you could read any account of world politics, both in practical terms and in critical ones. In terms, that is, of the world that it either disclosed or explained, or in terms of the interests that that particular and partial disclosure either served or obscured. When you did that, you created a potential space for a new kind of creative and intuitive thinking to begin. And it occurred to me that if theory is to be understood, as we're always told in our intro to IR class, that theory is theorein, and theorein is Greek for passionate contemplation, well, that was a pretty good way to do passionate contemplation, and that's what we ought to be doing. And it occurred to me further as I went back to the early scholars in the field, Hans Morgenthau and Hertz and Raymond Aron and Arnold Wolfers and Karl Deutsch and Ernst Haas and Hedley Bull and Martin White, because by this time I'm now sort of sitting for comps, right? So I have to read all these fellows. It occurs to me that this is what they had all seemed to have been shooting for, a kind of sustainably critical approach to world politics in which practical problem solving and critical self-reflection are held in some kind of productive equipoise. It seemed to me further that what IR scholars sometimes call the great debates, those debates that have given the field its shape, were actuated by moments in which it was generally understood that this attempt had gone awry. It then occurred to me that perhaps the Frankfurt School Social Theory could help create that sustainably critical thinking space. And, well, okay, now I've kind of gone past the anecdote, and I need to start nailing down some terms, right? So what do I mean by a sustainably critical approach to IR? Right? Well, I mean an approach to international theory in which there is a sustained balance between theorizing of a practical knowledge-building variety and theory of a critical or reflexive variety. By critical theory, I mean bodies of social science theory in which methods are leveraged in order to create useful knowledge about the world. Such theory seeks the intelligent manipulation of human and natural forces in the service of values and develops methodologies to that end. By critical or reflexive theory, I mean bodies of theory in which the connections between facts and values are problematized. The passion to remake the world reflects a kind of a priori, the desire to remake the world reflects a kind of a priori passion for it. The world should be otherwise, right? That sense of passion, right? That's what animates inquiry, right? Interrogating that sense of passion, where it comes from and what it means, asking whether it's rooted in idle curiosity or full-bore messianism, asking whether you fancy yourself a tinkerer or an experimenter or a would-be revolutionary. That's reflection. That's exploring passion as a non-neutral actor in inquiry. How we deal with that, how we keep aware of our animating values, even when we are in the guts of complex problems, in the heat of academic debate, or in the stress of real-world political problems, while not falling into something more self-indulgent, navel-gazing, if you like. This is the primary problem to which sustainable critique addresses itself. Such an approach, then, is not simply the application of critique to projects by other people whose values you don't like, right? It strives to be inward-looking. It strives to be self as well as other-directed. It strives to systematically chasten the truth claims of international theory, practical theory in particular, but without depriving that theory of the ability to meaningfully address problems in world politics, right? One wants to reflect, but not get lost in the forest of one's own reflections. It strives to infuse each moment of thinking, practical and critical, with appreciation for the necessity of the other. In the book, I call this ethos the animus habitandi, the will to dwell or to abide within a complex world, in the world that is, and not in our thoughts. The term is an homage to Hans Morgenthau, who spoke of an animus dominandi, a will to dominate, which he suggested was a basic fact in international politics. For its part, the animus habitandi suggests a basic inability to transcend the world we have, to create a once and for all kind of knowledge from some perfect Archimedean perch. Our natural desire as practical theorists is to shed all that, to produce nicely linear, crystal clear explanatory narratives of cause and effect. If you can do it with numbers, even better. And that can be a worthy exercise sometimes, especially if you can count past 7, which I can't, but I'll try. That can be a worthy exercise, but even if so, we must will ourselves to some degree to remain in the muck of something preconceptual and, well, not quite as crystal clear or as linear as all that. Now, most of what we associate with contemporary bodies of international theory is practical, regardless of whether it goes by the name normative, critical, or positive. Whether we're talking about the design of workable international institutions, at least on my account, right? Whether we talk about the design of workable international institutions, the study of deterrence, the study of how norms emerge in the international community, studies of political security, or studies of how gender and identity are used to create, shape, or manipulate consensus, all that's going to be practical knowledge for Levine. Right? What I mean to suggest then is, again, if my account holds right, which in Q&A might not, it suggests that there's a lopsided quality to developments in our field. It's not just that our scholars have ignored the need for critique. On the contrary, as I said before, they recognized that there was a need there. Right? What's lacked, or what has been lacking, I should say, is a systematic approach to building critical perspectives to compare with the efforts given to practical theory. Practical theory moves from strength to strength. Critical theory emerges as a kind of afterthought, right? You read that, the last chapter of a book where someone goes, well, yes, of course, I know there are more complicated things, but I had to finish my dissertation, so I couldn't talk about them. Anyway, there's a confidence interval, yada, yada, yada. Right? That's that moment of afterthought, right? That's when that happens. And maybe someone else should really talk about the doubts that emerge from this, but for God's sake, not me, because I really want to have clear stuff that I can show with the American Political Science Association, because I have a job talking next year, right? So that's kind of how the field works. Because of this, our theories have a tendency to become reified. They become naturalized such that we and the concepts upon which they are predicated become conflated with things in themselves. As those who think for a living, we have a special role in how the world comes into being. Reification leads us to forget this. We come to believe that we are simply describing an already extant world as it happens contingently to impress itself upon our senses. We thus become freed of any responsibility for that world or for any responsibility for the things we say about it or how they congeal to things out there. Okay, so I've tried to give you a kind of anecdotal introduction into this, like, hey, here's how I came by this, and oh, here, by the way, here's what I mean by it. Let me quickly walk through why I think why it's proven a little bit elusive, and then let's jump into the Israel-Palestine stuff, because that's really the stuff I'm working on now. So why is this approach proven elusive? I think the answer is that we lacked a sufficiently muscular account of reification. But for that answer to make sense, we need to look at how our theory has tried to deal with it and to understand the limitations of those attempts. Those of us who received a traditional introduction into the field are often trained to think of it as hard-nosed and value-free. But I want to suggest to you that while that may be true in an epistemological sense, how we make sense of things, right, that it's actually grounded in a much deeper humanistic notion, for good or for ill, humanistic both in the good sense and in the bad sense. It's grounded in a much more deeply humanistic enterprise than that. It's actually grounded in something I would like to call a caring vocation, a vocation that stemmed from the shock of the violence of the mid-20th century. The empirical surprise, the megathalmazane, the great shock of wonderment that emerged when it was discovered that the entire surface of the world had been rendered vulnerable to human agency and to human short-sightedness. That moment had to be discovered, and transport yourself back to that moment of discovery, and you see in it the kind of passion for remaking the world that we now receive as international relations theory in all of its glory. Naturally, that ethos of care places a premium on what I've called practical theory. How can you care for the world without proposing ways to care for it, right? Yet the role of theory changed radically as a result of the events of the 20th century, complicating this caring effort considerably and making critique both more difficult, but also more necessary. This, for Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, is what's known as the dialectic of enlightenment thesis, right? That bodies of theory ostensibly emancipatory are in fact sometimes forms of oppression. That theory doesn't always do the work we think it's done. Now, this point is made most strongly in Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, right? But we see glimpses of it throughout mid-20th century social theory generally, chiefly in the work of Max Weber. In the book, as Beata noted, I rely a lot on Adorno, right? But I'm going to stick with Weber here to develop the problem philosophically and in an explanatory way for us because, well, I think Weber is uniquely compelling and uniquely compact, and Teddy is never compact. He's occasionally compelling, but he's never compact. So, in Weber's famous Sciences of Vocation lecture, right, those of you who've read it, think back to it. Right? He concludes by telling us that the late modern project of rationalization, this project of demystifying the world, removing the specters of ignorance and superstition, has inadvertently led to loss of affect and to alienation, what he will elsewhere call the iron cage. Weber seems of two minds about this. Looking at Germany's growing political radicalization at the end of World War I, he's clearly bothered by what it might portend. At times, he seems to believe that if the project can only be hastily brought to its conclusion, that perhaps everything will be all right. Perhaps we'll be able to pull ourselves back. Yet he ends the essay with a paraphrase from Isaiah 21, a homily presaging the coming of the Messiah. Watchman, what of the long night? And the watchman responds, this is from Isaiah, when morning comes, still it shall be night. It is one of the most beautiful and cryptic passages in the Hebrew Bible, and in Hebrew school we spent a lot of time arguing about it. What does it mean here? The long night for Isaiah is the long night of the Israelites' diaspora, the redemption from which is God's promise to his faithful. For Weber, it is the long night of superstition and traditionalism, the redemption from which is rationalism's promise to humanity, the vocation of science. What is the vocation of science? To free you from that earlier stuff. But when morning comes, when we are redeemed from such darknesses, still it will be night. For a perfectly rationalized society will be as totalizing and potentially as oppressive as anything had come before it. Hence, when morning comes, it shall also be night. In general terms, I mean to suggest, this is the thesis of the dialectic of enlightenment, that practical knowledge is emancipatory, but it's also generative of new oppressions. And since those new forms and patterns of oppression will be fundamentally dissimilar from the old ones, they will be invisible to us if all we have are concepts we inherited from analyzing older forms and orders. Think of how different modern life is from the life of your great whatever, right? Most likely that person grew potatoes, right? Think of how different your life is from that person, right? If all you've done is study the forms of oppression characteristic of that earlier form of life, and now you're in this one, but your concepts only point back to that one, how on earth will you make sense of the particular forms of oppression that are endemic to the University of Sussex? I'm sure there are a few, but we'll talk about it in Q&A. I'll be interested to know. Now, if we don't think through, if we don't develop those new concepts, we're liable to start thinking that particular technical or administrative innovations in particular social or historical contexts will produce moral progress. Think, if you like, about works like Bourdieu's Weight of the World or Jim Scott's Seeing Like a State. What's important about these books? What's important about them, at least for me, is they reveal how administrative innovation can help hide the suffering they suborn, even as the elites believe that they're agents of moral progress. The elite gets trained at a good government school and is solving a problem, right? And she goes back to her country and she implements that problem that she solves, and she comes to believe that she is in fact an agent of moral progress, right? Because she's reformed the agricultural sector in her home country, right? And there may be some new form of oppression out there that's being caused, but she won't see it, right? She won't see it because she has no lens for it. She has no concept for it, right? And so the technocrat comes to believe herself to be an agent of moral progress, right? There's nothing miraculous there. That's modernity, right? We all know what versions of that story. Now, this is a problem for theorists, especially a problem for theorists whose subject matter is as close to mass violence, as close to war and total destruction as international relations sometimes purports itself to be. For in developing a caring theory, one must draw on existing normative political traditions, matching them to the new methodologies emerging from the professionalization of poli-sci in the 50s and 60s. That's where practical theory comes from. But which traditions do you choose? Which traditions haven't been stained by the catastrophes of the previous half-century? Liberalism, Marxism, corporatism, nationalism? Do any of them look good after 1945? Right, so where do you pick? Where do you start? Right? Oh yeah, and that moment where you're the administrative person and you're fixing the right? And, well, there's always that hope that 40 years later you'll wake up and you go, oh my God, I really did a terrible thing to those farmers, right? I should really go back and try to fix that. That's great if you're an agricultural specialist, because 40 years later there will still be a world. But if you're a nuclear arms specialist, there may not be one. Right? So you won't have that moment for reflection, and so now you need to be practical and reflexive in the same actual moment. Right? Alors, the problem. Early scholars in IR didn't know how to deal with this problem, but they were aware of it. Right? Carr is aware of it through Karl Mannheim and the Fabians. Haas is aware of it through Weber, Hartz and Morgenthau through Schmidt, and, well, also Weber. But these scholars are only suggestive in how this problem is supposed to be dealt with. Systematic treatments of the problem don't come. Practical theory is developed, critical theory is merely hinted at. Unfortunately, suggesting the need for a thing and thinking through its intellectual conditions of possibility are not the same. In sum, lacking a systematic approach to critique along the lines which early IR scholars gesture to but don't really follow up on, the caring humanistic vocation of IR as a discipline goes astray. It withers on the vine. It founders on the shoals of reification. It conflates epistemologies with ontologies. It gets wrapped in petty interdisciplinary debates. It conflates prudence with virtue, concepts with things, narratives with events, analyses with prescriptions. In short, it ceases to be reflexive or sustainably critical in the image of the animus actandi. All right, so brief anecdotal introduction, tried to nail down some theory, some key concepts, tried to show why this is proven elusive. Let's move to this last point, this notion of a politics of Jewish fear that I referred to, and how sustainable critique might help us get at it. So the book that's been honored tonight makes the argument that you've got up to this point in a more thoroughgoing fashion, explaining what reification is, how it works in IR theory, and then surveying a variety of theorists and research programs with an eye to surveying how their approaches speak to the ideals of sustainable critique, but lack the muscular account of reification needed to make good on them. In the concluding chapter of this book, I use the example with which I opened this talk to provide a framework for how a sustainably critical research program might succeed. That is, I meant to suggest, if the field is to actually speak meaningfully to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if its research programs are not really to be a means to endow partisan positions in it with a veil of scientific objectivity, if they are, if you like, to recover their vocation vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, then international relations scholars need to try to make good on them. In that vein, I suggested we need to work along certain kinds of multi-paradigmatic lines to tell different and mutually exclusive stories about the conflict such that each undercut but also complemented the other. The key point in that multi-paradigmatic outline was for a scholar to be critically disposed not merely to the conflict's reducibility to any one story, level of analysis or point of view, after all that's pretty run-of-the-mill critical theory stuff, but also to take one's own inability to tell a story adequately as a foundational argument. That is to say, the theorist can never be identical with herself. One must both tell stories that one thinks are important while undercutting one's own privileged position as anything more than, well, a storyteller. There are to be no avatars of critique here, as we so often see on the intellectual left, when the personality of a Foucault, a Said, an Arendt, or a Bourdieu, or a Haraway, and I'm using those names only as an example, I like their work very much, and I mean nothing personal to them, appear to us to smile over our ostensibly radical theory and bless it. I've been trying for the past year or so to start that work, and doing so has led me to revise and complicate my thinking somewhat, so let me spend the remainder of my time sharing my thoughts on that point. Now this is going to be a little bit messier than what you've gotten up till now, right? It's messier for two reasons. One, because I'm still thinking it through myself, and messier two, because I'm struggling with that same question, how one tells a story and keeps faith with one's own inadequacy as a storyteller. Like, yeah, I kind of think my story is important, but I kind of think that the story I want to tell is important, but I also think that my story is important. Well, first of all, it ain't that important. I mean, it's mine, so I think it's important. But part of what makes it important is that it, in its incompleteness, helps summon other stories out, right? And so it only matters to the extent that those other stories come, and those other stories then make it less important, because the whole point here is that no one story is everything. At all events, there's a tension when you start thinking that way, when you start saying, well, what's my vocation? What am I called to say? On the one hand, and undercutting yourself, your status as a storyteller on the other. And working through that tension has proven a little bit naughty. It makes it difficult for you to find your way in. Let me explain for a second what I mean. That earlier sense of vocation that I told you about, that held the field together, what does it mean to have a sense of vocation? Well, it means more or less to be called to something, right? I mean, if you haven't seen the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, right? Moses, come over here, take off your shoes, this is holy ground. Oh my goodness, okay. See the burning bush, don't touch it, burning. Right, you're called to something, right? It is to be called out of an existing social or political milieu so that you can hear a certain inner voice and use that inner voice to speak truthfully to the milieu in which you find yourself. But that assumes that that inner voice has some moral or epistemological authority, and then the following question is, well, okay, does it? I mean, for Moses it does, because like, hey, Yahweh, right? But Yahweh doesn't talk to me all that often, right? Or at least, if he does, well, I don't know, at the very least, I don't know, what is the moral authority of that inner voice that calls me, right? Certainly Isaiah and Weber both thought that their inner voices had that kind of moral authority, right? Isaiah thinks he's speaking God's word. Weber wants science to speak in a voice that's comparably authoritative. But for the reflexive social scientist that I'm talking about, well, you have to give an account for that voice and for its origin, for what it is and for what it ain't. All the more so, given that I'm promising, after all, to tell stories about Israel and Palestine, and mutually exclusive claims of transcendent are so patently a part of that conflict, right? There's a particularly fraught space which this conflict occupies in a lot of Middle Eastern, American, and European imaginaries. I don't have to tell any of you that. That overlap between the political and the theological is not unique to Israel or Palestine. Louisa would kill me if I said that it was, right? But this conflict, it does play a particularly powerful role in this conflict, and that complicates our conversations considerably. So while I don't want to fall into a jargon of exceptionalism, I also want to acknowledge the power of that moment. To be reflexive in such an instance is to recognize the odd sort of psychological displacement that characterizes one's inner voice without disposing of it altogether. It is to walk a razor's edge. A chastened sense of vocation would thus assume this. What calls us is nothing more than our own fumbling, imperfect inner sense, an urge, affect, or disposition that tells us how the world should be told or narrated differently than it is. If that sense of calling seems fanciful to you, or if you see the Academy primarily as a power game, ask yourself the following. Have you never, at one time or another, felt really, fundamentally, and essentially right about something that you wrote or that you read? So much that, have you ever come across a truth that felt so well true that it kind of made your hands shake? Remember when you were 19 and you were a college sophomore and you were sitting in that dorm room, I don't know, do they call them sophomores? When you were a second year undergraduate, right? And you were sitting in the dorm lounge, right, with your friends saying, oh my God, and there was a lava lamp and there was Jimi Hendrix playing in the background. It's, oh my God, but is it really true, man? Is it really true? Right, remember those moments you had that? They felt so true. For me, it was the first time I read Orientalism, right? It made my hands shake, right? All right, so now imagine that you're a scholar and you write something like that. It feels really true. It feels like you were communing with Plato and the forms, right? And then you wake up in the cold light of day and you read that text. And yeah, you've been abandoned by whatever was with you and it was never there, And it's like if it were a date, you'd be having that conversation. Listen, it's just not really working out, right? How many times have you heard a colleague say something like, well, I just have to believe that we're making a difference. I just have to believe. I used to be at a liberal arts college. Right, and we go, oh, I just have to believe we're making the kids think. I just have to believe that. Well, gig is a thing, you have to believe, right? But where's the reflexivity in that position? A sense of calling, in other words, still obliges us to give an account of where the calling comes from and to reflect on its limitations or pitfalls. The fact that you have to believe something, the fact that your hands shook, well, that's not nothing, and we don't want to trivialize that, right? Some of the best moments of my young life were involved a lava lamp and discussions about, I don't know, Kurt Vonnegut or whatever it was, and actually you did get at something, and that something sort of mattered, right? And I don't want to say that it doesn't, even if I'm also kind of making fun of it myself, and maybe some of you as well, but I don't need to, right? It is ours, and it matters, but it's not to be accepted merely because it can be verbalized. This may be why so many in our field, so many IR scholars, are turning to odd autobiographical or novelistic self-representations, a little bit like the one I gave you before, right? Think about scholars who scholars who want us to understand that the sum of their thinking is not the paradigms and research methods that their comprehensive examiners drilled into them. In many cases, those sorts of literary self-disclosures have an apologetic or expiatory element. Think of Elizabeth Dauphiné reflecting on how her career was made from the Bosnian catastrophe, or Oded Lowenheim, professor at Hebrew University, reflecting on his ambiguous position as a scholar within the Israel-Palestine conflict. Such narrative self-accounts are not unproblematic for any number of reasons. Nevertheless, they proceed from what I think is a solid philosophical intuition. Judith Butler, in giving an account of oneself, tells us that our subjective need to appear in a certain way to others is not something we can deny ourselves for too long. If we do ourselves harm. Right? We can work on ourselves to recognize that our desire to appear, that my desire to appear as myself, may be due to the fact that power has been done to me, violence has been done to me, trauma has been done to me, or that, some of that desire is just caprice. I can work on myself and bring out that awareness, but even so, I can't completely deny my desire to appear as myself. If I do, ressentiment begins to gnaw away at me from within, and as Yoda tells us, that's really bad. That has bad effects on the world. When our relationships are defined by politics, by deep difference, that desire may appear to others, may cause us to oblige others to give up a piece of themselves. If that sounds abstract to you, imagine doing something like this. Go to one of those settlers I told you about before and say, I'm a Palestinian and I have a right to this land and I demand that you accept that. Right? Or, not even I demand it, I really, really need you to get that. Right? And that settler will have to give up something of himself. Right? Or that Palestinian will have to give up something of himself. Or, something will have to happen there. At any rate, there's no political world within which those two self-disclosures can happily coexist. Right? They are, to some extent, mutually exclusive. Right? Well, what right does anyone have to ask anyone else to give up something of themselves simply so that you can feel good about yourself? The answer is, there is no such right. Right? Our needs have no objective or transcendent basis other than our own desire, and neither does anyone else's. We are human beings, and we suffer, and we're vulnerable, and we can die. We have needs. We can offer love. We can offer friendship. There's lots of things we can give to one another. Right? But we can't demand it. So if we choose to give accounts of ourselves to one another, we give the other person the chance to choose to give up something of themselves or enter into conversation with us about how we might create something new in which nobody has to give up anything. Or to ask forgiveness, of that person for the stuff we think we need to take away. Hey, I'm sorry that this messes up your day, but I just kind of think this is important about me and I kind of need you to get it. Right? How many of you have had a conversation like that? At least in those moments, whether or not you get what you want, you know what you're asking for, and so does that other person, and that's not nothing. That searching inward expression of one's own obligation is, I believe, what these autobiographic accounts gesture to. It may be true that this or that version of them can be either aesthetically jejune or philosophically insufficient, but that doesn't mean there isn't a problem there, and these approaches don't gesture to how you think about them, In that vein, what's my own sense of calling here, and how has it caused me to rethink what I want to study? The answer lies in this notion that I'm calling a politics of Jewish fear. Scholars both in Israel and abroad have long discussed that state's extreme concern with national security issues, what is sometimes called, its culture of national security. Both critics of Israeli foreign and security policy and those sympathetic to it, moreover, explain that culture as something essentially or uniquely Jewish, a manifestation of a particular form of fear that is unique to this particular form of life. Certainly, those explanations vary in idiom. They may be phrased in psychological terms as a feature of uniquely intense collective memories or historical traumas, in religious strategic ones, of Israel as a nation that dwells alone and thus must want for allies, or in political sociological ones as producing a unique combination of institutions and stressors. But in all these cases, the uniqueness of this particular form of fear serves as a primary point of analytical departure. Think, if you like, if you want an example, of the discourse surrounding Israeli exceptionalism, right? The claptrap about Israel's only democracy and so forth and so on, right? What's always unstated in those kinds of claptrappy exceptionalisms, right, is imagine, they go through and with their democracy and all that, how many they have to serve in the army, and they're still a democracy. It's really exceptional, right? So a unique form of fear, a unique institutional response, right, is used to generate an explanation about this particular form of life. Reflecting Israeli politics through the lens of Jewish fear, but without unpacking that fear, without giving it an explicit name or a genealogy, has, in my opinion, at least two deleterious effects. The first is to open up criticism of Israel to a particularly vicious cycle of outrage and ad hominem accusation. To criticize Israeli politics becomes an assault upon Jewish suffering, a denial of Jewish suffering. As Edward Said noted in the 1980s, this was the enormous and unfair burden imposed on the Palestinian national movement, which could be so easily rhetorically dismissed with a knee-jerk charge of anti-Judaism. And that, in turn, discredits the actual discussion of those brands of anti-Judaism, which sometimes exist in some circles, right? So the whole game of mobilizing fear and shame follows from that not genealogization of that particular form of fear. Second, however, failing to think through the structuring effects of Jewish fear on Israeli state policy pulls us away from a consideration of the circumstances within which that policy emerges. To that end, the work I'm starting on now centers on recovering the political and strategic discourse of the Yishuv, the pre-independence political community in Palestine, the pre-independence Jewish political community in Palestine, through a variety of primary source documents. The key dates from here are the 1920s and the 1930s, the 1920s after the attacks on the Jewish community in Hebron, and the 1930s when the British government announced its intention to quit Palestine within 10 years against the backdrop of the Czech crisis, the Palestinian revolt of the 1930s, and the Afghan conflicts. In this period, the Yishuv develops an extreme version of strategic autarky, even as it recognizes its long-term regional prospects are not especially promising. What this produces is an odd kind of activist fatalism, the effects of which will persist even to this day. Those of you who know something about Israeli foreign and security policy will know about phrases like there is no alternative, ein breva, right? Or a phrase that that gets heard a lot in Israel is "Zeh ma yesh v'im zeh lo natzeach." Like, this is what we've got and we're going to have to live with it. This is a kind of activist fatalism that I'm talking about, right? There is no alternative like this. My suspicion is that we allied this fatalism into a kind of colonialist will to power, or else lump it too closely with the effects of the Shoah. In so doing, we lose sight of what Zionists in Palestine well before Auschwitz thought they were doing wrong. Since the late 19th century, Jews in Europe and elsewhere have been struggling with the problem of what Weber called modernity's disenchantment of the world. We talked about it a little before. As we said, Jews and Christians both experience disenchantment as a kind of sundering, a loss of existential meaning and divine protection. With the coming of modernity, we are told by scholars like A.L. Chowers and Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi that sense of divine protection begins to disappear. Jews, like others, find themselves subjected to the unbridled effects of the same dislocating economic, political, and technological forces that affect all of Europe. But they have different options, and they experience it in different ways. That particular Jewish experience can be summed up in what is sometimes called the Judenfrage, before that question was polluted by its takeover by fascism and the final solution. The Judenfrage was a term, the Jewish question. What do we do about this particular body and its particular conditions, and how does late modern national democracy accommodate it? How must they change, or how must it change? Taken as a whole, this literature is exceedingly grim. Jewish historians and social theorists see only the need for radical transformation, and even then, their prognosis for Jewish survival is not especially optimistic. Some of the outcomes of those studies, that social science, that history, those cultural studies, are what authorize the political movements that come to be Jewish politics in the 20th century, and Zionism is one of those. Some echo of that fear survives still in Israelis and diaspora Jews' continuing obsessions with statistics about demographics, intermarriage, and what is sometimes called Jewish continuity. In literary terms, we find them in the writings of novelists like Chaim Chazaz and Yoram Kanio. For those of you who don't know it, Chaim Chazaz is a short story called The Sermon, in which it's an odd philosophical conversation that exists between a bunch of young men in the Haganah, the pre-Jewish independence force, military force, in which they're asking, what are we doing here? Why are we here? We forgot. Right? And they now have to walk through every intellectual move that brought them to Palestine and what they're doing. Right? Oh, yeah, well, Judaism's doomed, right? And we're here because, and oh yeah, we're here because, and oh yeah, we're here because. And yeah, the funniest thing, or not the funniest thing, the most interesting thing about this short story, in addition to how there's a lot of good stuff about it, one of the most interesting things is Arabs appear in nowhere. Right? But this conversation that's taking place is a conversation in which there are probably about, at that time, there's probably about 100,000 Jews in Palestine, maybe 70,000. Right? The population of Palestine is at this point about 80% Palestinian Arabs. Right? And yet these folks, they're completely absent. They're like the African Americans in a Tennessee Williams play. They're just not there. Right? And that tells you something not just about colonialist will to power. Right? It also tells you something, because this is a very self-searching conversation about people who've read a lot of Marx and know a lot about reflexivity and know a lot about commodity fetishism and all that stuff. Right? It's just not on their radar because a lot of other stuff's on their radar. Right? And so it's not just about what's not there. It's also about recovering what's there. Right? For Zionists in Palestine, the events of the 20s and 30s thus seem to confirm, deepen, and intensify deeply pessimistic intuitions that underpin a broad swath of Jewish social science and social theory over the previous 5 decades. This forms the discursive backdrop, informing what Zionists in Palestine think they need to be doing. This is not to dismiss or to ignore the colonialist or orientalist aspects of Zionist thought in this period. It is simply to suggest that colonialism is not reducible simply to racism or simply to the will to power, even if those things are also there, and they are also there. A second point follows from this notion of Jewish fear, which I've set out here. The tendency to essentialize Israeli security concerns under the label Jewish fear, or to take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and put it, if you like, in specialist brackets. It's now something that Dennis Ross is going to handle, or that Tony Blair, who you may know is now was for a while the UK's special rapporteur, right, for the peace process, right? And we've created a special bureaucracy for it. And when I worked for the Foreign Office, there were special foreign policy officers that dealt only with this, right? The tendency to translate this into a specialist field does more than merely skew conversations about Israel and Palestine. It contributes to a broader denial on the part of academics and policy intellectuals as to the essentially vulnerable nature of late modernity as a universal and cosmopolitan condition. By compartmentalizing or provincializing conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian, academics and policy intellectuals become complicit in this denial, freeing themselves from the burden of asking larger, more complicated, and more open-ended questions regarding ethics, power, and the use of force. Perhaps there is no state that can produce security from fear, given the global dimensions of late modern vulnerability, from nuclear war to extreme environmental degradation. Perhaps existing concepts and institutions are dangerously obsolete. To think along such lines, however, is to remove most of the institutional banisters that support contemporary political science, at least on my side of the Atlantic. I'm not sure about yours. Let me start to wrap it up here. This notion of Jewish fear I envision as the anchor point for the kind of multi-paradigmism I was calling about before. That is, we might through it ask ourselves what it is Jews thought they were afraid of when they turned to the notion of a national state. Why it was that so many different accounts of Jewish fear, so many different accounts of what it meant to be a Jew, and how late modernity had put that notion under threat, how all those happened to converge on the same structural institutional solution, a state. Don't take that stuff for granted, right? There's a fantastic essay by David Ben-Gurion called The Eternity of Israel. And the title is, well, it's kind of a long story. It's a basic kind of, I don't know, sort of second-tier rehashing of Rousseau's notion of civic religion. But at the beginning, he tells this little Ben-Gurion story. He says, I was there in 1948 when we signed the Scroll of Independence. Israel has a Scroll of Independence, right? Like the Declaration of Independence, but, scrollier, right? And he says, I was there, and let me tell you something, and I've read the Bible. Our notion of national unity at the signing of the Scroll of Independence, everybody was there, from the ultra-Orthodox to the communists. Everybody was there until he left us. It was fantastic. We had more unity on that day, he said, than we had when we were assembled around Mount Sinai waiting for the word of the Lord. Right? Now, yeah, okay, I don't know how seriously to take Ben Gurion on that point. What he's trying to tell us now, though, is that, well, this group is pretty fractious. And to reify it, to assume, oh yes, of course, they had national consciousness and behaved like an integral state, and they had a state ideology and blah, blah, blah. That's to reify a particular knowledge, right? And that's what I'm pointing out here. What's important about that story, about that moment is, well, it's not for nothing that all these groups agree on this particular institutional solution, right? Labor socialism is an important part of Zionism, right? The notion that a national state is the solution to their problem, well, a lot of trees have to die to explain how the withering away of the state and the creation of the Jewish state, work together. Yeah, a lot of trees have to die for that, right? Or in other words, it's a complicated argument that illustrates itself. We might then ask whether that national state could in fact give them security from those fears, whether indeed any state could. This would give Jews both a clearer sense of what they owe to Palestinians by way of apology and recompense, a searching explanation of why their forebears did as they did, but also what they would need if they were going to ask in a genuine or meaningful conversation about conflict resolution and mutual security. It might also help free Palestinians of the burden, pardon me, oh, there's a little bug there, to guarantee Israeli security. Through a sturdy notion of Jewish fear, Palestinians would be freer to point out to Israelis what ought already to be obvious, that they are only one piece of a constellation of causes and forces that compose Jewish fear, and that they have been made most unfairly and most improbably to shoulder the burden of all of it. If you doubt the degree to which this sort of myopia structures conversations about Israel and Palestine, you might ask a negotiator from America or Britain this: when did any of you ask how Palestinians are meant to feel secure in this particular security arrangement, or what their fears are? By way of closing, let me give you a sense of why I want to do this work and why I think it's important. As a scholar, but also as a person in the world, I don't really have a much better formulation. I struggled with that formulation for a long time. As a person in the world and as a scholar, I feel a strong desire to ask for Palestinian forgiveness. That the Jewish ingathering was purchased by the Palestinian diaspora seems certain to me. That the occupation of the West Bank persists because what used to be called the Israeli left, in which I was at one time active, is more scared of the settlers than they are mindful of Palestinian rights. Well, I think the same holds there. Given, however, that the way in which guilt and fear are weaponized in this conflict, the way in which shame is weaponized in this conflict, one needs to speak about those desires in a particularly careful way. There is a calculus of pain and suffering and their mobilization in this conflict, no less rigorous or perfunctory than anything Bentham could have dreamt up. And given the enormous power imbalance between Israelis and Palestinians and the ongoing fact of the Palestinian occupation, it's not really clear to me how that fantasy conversation where I ask somebody for forgiveness, it's not really clear to me how that would happen, right? That feels to me like some sort of weird Habermasian daydream, with some kind of communicative action, apology could happen, right? And I'm not really sure that such a conversation is possible. Perhaps then the exercise in recovering Jewish fear lies in an inner desire to interrogate myself, to ask what I feel culpable for precisely. Whether Palestinians were dispossessed with malice aforethought, or whether, as I suspect, their disposition was rooted partly in that, and partly in a world of limited knowledge, political contingency, and flawed prudential judgment in which they were themselves imbricated, involves a dense, searching examination as to what people at the moment thought they were doing. Otherwise, the request to be forgiven becomes what Adorno once called hotel gravy. That's that thick, white, pasty gravy you use to pour over badly cooked cuts of meat that have sat in the steam table too long. Right? Well, whatever it is, I'm just sorry, okay? I'm just sorry. Can we stop talking about it now? Right? Like, you've dated, if you've had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's not the apology that says, let's talk about what's wrong here. That's the apology that says, let's not talk about this anymore. Let's just make this all go away, right? In my day job, I teach politics at the University of Alabama. For those of you who don't know American history, the University of Alabama is the place where the National Guard had to be mobilized to allow African Americans to mobilize, right? And to allow African Americans to register for classes. And that latter kind of apology, hey, I'm just sorry, and I've endowed this clock tower, and I've named some stuff after Martin Luther King, and now we're not doing anything else. We're not talking about anything else. We're just doing it. Okay, I'm just sorry. Well, that's funny. I really want to talk about what it feels like to be African American. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Don't put that part on. Those forms of apology then do not open up discussions of responsibility, or anyway, don't let my tenure committee see. They mean to conceal it, as when Americans apologize for racism or genocide against Indians, but do so not to, or African Americans, but do so not to confront the lingering effects of those actions so much as to simply put them behind oneself. So in addition to asking for forgiveness, I want to tell a story that makes Zionism make sense as a contingent historical emergence, not as a response to a particular set, rather, to make it as a contingent historical emergence, as a response to a particular set of circumstances and moments. Not because I think those circumstances and moments excuse past or contemporary excesses or harms, but rather because I want those harms and excesses to appear as harms and excesses, because the actual problems which Zionism was ostensibly meant to solve have been brought into light, and the excess then appears as the excess. Or to put it differently, as students of world politics, we have labored for half a century to come to terms with the legacy of what we sometimes loosely call positivism, the notion that we can sit outside the political world and to judge dispassionately, objectively, the interactions of individuals and draw conclusions about them. The danger of such thought, we are told, is that it turns people into objects, and that in turn serves their instrumentalization in any number of oppressive projects, from imperial expansion to mass industrial warming. If we are serious about moving past this mode of thinking, not merely denouncing it when we don't like the political projects of others, but reproducing its basic forms when it serves our own purposes, we need to try to reconstruct the dense webs of meaning and understanding from which politics and policies emerge. We need to do so with a delicate balance of compassion and judgment, reconstructing the worlds within which individuals acted, but without making apology for those actions. And that's what I'm hoping for, and when that book comes out, you can tell me whether I did a good job. Thank you very much indeed.